I'm going to take it from the start here, but I will speak for Chris, who you'll be hearing from soon. Thanks for having us, and we're excited to share with you guys with what we've learned over the years. A few things to get out of the way first is one is it's not alluded to in the presentation, but the presentation will be focused on detection of mountain pine beetle killed trees for a few reasons, which we'll get to soon. We're going to be sharing information from 4 different projects that we've done over the past about 10 years. They're a little bit different, all of them in the level of detail that we're trying to collect, so the purposes of the information that we're trying to use it for, which in turn, I guess, has steered us into different types of imagery and different resolutions. As well, the projects, some of them are kind of on more of the fully operationalized spectrum of it, and then all the way down to sort of proofs of concept. So we're gonna go through a whole series of those. The other thing to mention is that we recognize that what we're doing here with red tree detection in most cases isn't brand new, not necessarily hot off the press. There's been a lot of work done, obviously in British Columbia and elsewhere in the world. And a lot of what we're doing is we're trying to build off of some of these things that have already been learned. So some of this not brand new, not necessarily hot off the press, like I said, but we feel that it's important to share because sometimes there are the devils in the details. Before we get into those projects, though, I want to set the stage a little bit with some background information. First of all, why mountain pine beetle program? Why have we had the opportunity to get into the remote sensing business? And for a few reasons. One is just the significant effort and longevity of the program has provided us with this sort of fertile territory for innovation, which you don't often get. So we're trying to take advantage of that situation. And moving into the future, we do know that we are going to be managing mountain pine beetle at least in the short term. I'm excited to let you know who don't already know that Alberta and Natural Resources Canada are now have an officially signed contribution agreement. So we're going to be doing some co-management, joint management in mountain pine beetle control in Alberta. So that's going to be happening for the next couple of years. So and part of that also is dealing with research and technology development. So we will hopefully be continuing on with this type of thing. Currently, the sort of status quo with our manual non-remote sensing type detection, we generally speaking have 2 types that we use. One we term a heli GPS survey. This is what a lot of aerial surveyors would kind of be characterized as a detailed survey. So we're actually looking at point level data where the helicopter is hovering over a relatively low level and getting a GPS location of a point and then giving a number of infested trees that location. And that information is driving our single tree control program annually. So this is something that we do every year while we're in the business of controlling mountain pine beetle. The fixed wing overview survey is not used as much for mountain pine beetle for a couple of reasons. One is that if you see on our map here, that 7.8 million hectares is the heli GPS area that we mapped this past fall. So the majority of the mountain pine beetles where it's actively killing trees is within that area. There is an area to the north where mountain pine beetle has been active from the onset of the infestation almost 20 years ago. But that area, the infestation's kind of subsided. So we don't necessarily do large polygon mapping up there anymore. One of the reasons being is we've developed some pretty decent remote sensing techniques, go figure. So if you're interested in that, you're in the right place. Our goal here is not to necessarily replace these surveys. We've heard that from a few different folks in the series because we've all recognized that there are some limitations and we'll get into those as we move on. But the bottom line is we're trying to offset some of this manual work. If we can find tools that are giving us data that's as good as the stuff that we can collect manually, as well, we want it to be cost effective. So if we can do it as cheap or cheaper than we can do it manually, those 2 things, those are some pretty good check boxes to check off to use these tools. And the last thing, probably the more important of them all, is we're trying to get people out of aircrafts. The heli GPS survey that we did last year, that almost 8 million hectares, took almost 2,000 hours of flight time. And that is low level, relatively slow flight, and it's dangerous work. So that is one of the goals too here. The next part of the background, setting the stage with relation to remote sensing, is the signal that we're looking for from these mountain pine beetle attacked trees. A brief description of this for some of those who might not be as familiar with the beetle. But there are a lot of times people term them attack stages. So we have our a tree that has been attacked, but it's essentially the needles are still green, and then as it changes color, you often hear the term red attack and then gray attack. So that's as you go through time, there is a progression. It's important to note that beetles have actually attacked the tree the year before anything on this slide. And it's not until the following summer or spring that the tree starts to turn color. So it's when the tree starts to turn color here in the summer is when the beetles are actually leaving those trees as well. And you'll see from the picture there that I've included this as a bit of a subtle difference between some of those colors of the fade. Obviously the green trees are the green ones, but you can see some faders here. There's one here, there's one here, there might even be one tucked back there. This one's kind of questionable. So those are the ones that are just started to turn the summer this photo was taken. And then there's some more here. These are probably the 1-year-old attacks. So they've been attacked 2 years ago. So the change is subtle, but it is there. And it's also part of the difficulty in this is that within years and between years, there's changes in the phenology of that fade. So it depends on things like moisture. It depends on the attack intensity on the trees. So sometimes the fade is late, sometimes the fade is early. So it's just important to kind of understand that. The next bit of background, I'm going to throw it over to Chris. Chris, you're with us, I hope.
I believe I am.
Good, you are. And
okay.
Next over to you to talk a bit about some of the additional data that we've been using to support these projects.
Sure. So this is more of just background, and it applies to the first two projects. An important data set we have access to is LiDAR, airborne laser scanning. Alberta was an early adopter of the technology and went down a rabbit hole collecting 37 million hectares between roughly 2007 and 2017. Our acquisition dates range from about 2003 to 2017. And the data set is very consistent. It's roughly 1 to 3 points per meter squared. And the original rationale for collecting the data was actually around mountain pine beetle. And the data weren't collected for the vegetation component. They were actually collected to create a high quality digital elevation model or bare earth terrain model to inform harvest planning with mountain pine beetle on its way. And so in 2007, I think I wasn't in Alberta, but my impression is that people like Mike saw mountain pine beetle coming, and people made the investment into the LiDAR for terrain modeling. That's that. Oh, sorry, Mike. I'm trying to switch slides. Can you switch the slide for me, Mike?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. In addition, we did take the LiDAR data and our PSP program, and we have derived our own in-house enhanced forest inventory products. So they include, boilerplate EFI attributes like volume and basal area and top height. And they're based on the LiDAR, our PSP data, and the Alberta vegetation inventory. So all of these, we actually don't use the EFI, LiDAR-derived EFI products directly in these projects, but our choice of spatial resolution did drive some of the decisions we made. So our PSP data, much of it, the PSPs are 1,000 square meters. And that drove our decision when we created our EFI products to use a 30-meter spatial resolution to approximate the size of our PSPs. Also, I love Landsat, so we chose 30 meters spatial resolution for these products, and everything just worked out that way. And as you'll see later, that choice of spatial resolution drove some of the choices we're going to make in some of these projects. So we don't necessarily use these EFI products directly in the two projects we're talking about, but they do influence the decisions we made. Next slide, Mike, please. Thanks. And some caveats, our LiDAR data is like arguably ending it's approaching the end of its useful shelf life. So the vast majority of the data we have in the areas we're working in with mountain pine beetle were collected around 2007, 2008. That said, you'll see it causes issues in terms of false positives, in terms of classifying mountain pine beetle. We'll discuss that later, but just keep in mind the vintage of the data. That said, it was still very, very useful for us. Next slide, Mike. So our first project is related to mapping. I'm going to use I'll probably, if I'm not careful, use the acronym ITC. And what I mean by that is individual tree crown classification, ITC, individual tree crown. So this project, we're looking at, actually skip to the next slide, Mike, and I'll might as well stick with a pretty picture. Yes, so this first project, we are mapping individual tree crowns, mortality at the tree crown scale, classifying red and gray attack. So the interest here was to map mountain pine beetle impacts in areas where we didn't have Hella GPS. And so you're just actually looking at a finished product here, but just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. So next slide, Mike. We collected imagery over 412 townships that had heavy pine content, all 30 centimeter spatial resolution. Next slide, Mike. So the imagery collected were 4-band, red, green, blue, and near infrared. And I'll just, kind of a lessons learned moment here. The near infrared band was really important for the success of this project, and the ability to derive the NDVI. And I'm pretty sure every presenter prior to us has mentioned NDVI, if I'm not mistaken. It's a ratio of red and near infrared, a difference ratio of the red and near infrared bands. And as you can see, the red crowns here are all like the dead trees are just leaping out at you in terms of the NDVI. And then on the bottom right, we have the LiDAR canopy height model. We use that model. We didn't use the LiDAR directly as a predictor variable. What we used it for is to identify merchantable stands. So in this case, we only looked at trees that were taller than 13 meters, I believe was the number. So it was a really important masking tool for us to have that canopy height model. Next slide, Mike, please. This work, one thing I should mention is that we don't have the in-house capacity to actually do 412 townships worth of classification. We had a contractor, Castless Consulting, do this work for us. We had an open bid or a competition. They won the competition. In-house, we did determine that we could do that, that this was a feasible project. We just couldn't do the production phase though in-house with the people we have. We just don't have the staff. But Castless used unsupervised classification. And Mike, if you could just point out the circled trees with your pointer.
Yeah, here.
So this on the top you have an image, and actually it's a stack of data. It's the 4 bands plus NDVI in an image in a band stack, and then I actually just did this like in 3 minutes. I just ran an ISO data cluster or analysis on the image, and the dead trees come out immediately. So this is a 10 class run. You can set the number of classes you want, but the point being is that the red and gray attack fell into classes 7 and 10, these purple pinkish colors. And from there, what you would do is you'd actually just grab those 2 classes and then do what's called so-called cluster busting. Rerun your cluster analysis, but only on those 2 classes to differentiate red from green. And so the cluster analysis is just really well suited to production, and it's quick. It's kind of arcane by remote sensing standards. People don't talk about it very often. Machine learning is all the rage these days, but this is still a very effective tool. So next slide, Mike. And this is what the classification looks like. We separate red and gray. And again, it requires no training data in terms of, it's really up to an analyst or interpreter's ability to assign these classes, otherwise unlabeled classes, into their correct categories. So again, we were extracting the red and the gray crowns. We did not map the green crowns, just the red and the gray. So next slide, Mike. In terms of quality assurance, Brooks Horn, one of the co-authors on this study, looked at 10 to 15 photo plots randomly established photo plots per township. And for a township to meet our standards, they had to be within plus or minus 15% accuracy for their identifying red and green trees. And I believe I believe Brooks mentioned the final number, like overall, I think they were just minus 4% in terms of estimating the number of dead trees on the landscape. But yeah, every township went through this QA examination with these photo plots. And this photo plot is 50 meters in diameter. And so, Mike, I think it's back to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So now the trick was, how do we use this information? So what we had to start with was these polygons, which were essentially gave us an area, a crown area of mortality. From knowing a little bit about mountain pine beetle, we know that pine beetle preferentially attacks the largest trees in the stand. So looking at this from a basal area impact, we knew that it wasn't going to be a direct apples to apples comparison. So we had to do a little bit of work, and it was through some ground survey assessments that kind of got us from this tree crown all the way to polygons of basal area mortality. And what we did, I should say we, the royal we, this was actually a project that was undertaken by the Forest Growth Organization of Western Canada through some grants. And there was 138 PSP plots that were measured, and they were all selected where we did have photography that was done. There was greater than 50% pine and more than 12%, 12 meters high. And as well, we selected the plots where there was a fairly significant amount of mortality, more than 20%. And what we found was what we expected, is that there isn't not a direct link. So there typically is more basal area loss than the percentage of crown mortality. So without getting into all the details, I think the technical term is we created a fudge factor that allowed us to create impact on timber analysis. So we looked at the cells, the specific cells, these 30-meter cells, and each of them then would have now what we've created a basal area impact from the area impacts. And then we've now moved and we've consolidated these adjacent polygons into minimum half-hectare size. So they have to meet that half-hectare size. And then we could essentially put thresholds however we wanted on these polygons, depending on the type of analysis we wanted to do. Here's a sample of one of the, I guess, primary reasons we set out on this project was to have a look at the timber supply analysis of this sort of cumulative impact. And I've just highlighted one example here of a forest management unit P19 South. This was the hardest hit of the forest management units within the photography area. We photographed 322,000 hectares of the unit, which wasn't all of it. But of that we photographed, there was almost 100,000 hectares of mature pine leading, so pine-dominated stands. And then when we looked at the analysis that we'd done with the remote sensing, we knew that 8,700 of those were dead. So they met that 50% basal area impact criteria. And then so you can do what you want with those numbers, and in the end we summed it up here. This is the total impact to the coniferous area of the FMU. So I mean, thankfully in this area there's lots of spruce, makes up a big component of the forest. So we were down to 3.5% impact overall. So it wasn't necessarily up there in that 8.7 range. So that's just an example of the types of information we were using it for. Obviously lots of other things aside from the forest management side of it. Wildfire preparedness and planning, very interested in this information. Also interested from the fact that it can be used, for example, those polygons that can be provided at different thresholds. So when you're looking at things like spread models, we can provide, what is a forest with 20% mortality versus a forest with 50% mortality. We had all the information at our fingertips to use for that. I'd also like to draw your attention to this, the picture on the bottom left here. This is an example of how we used, or how not we, but the forest company who was provided the information used it in their harvest sequencing. So the red that you see is the actual outputs for the project, and the imagery that you see was after the fact, after the harvesting, the salvage of that area had happened, and you can see that it's almost perfectly in line. So we knew that the information that we'd collected was being used. The cost of the project, it wasn't cheap. Altogether, it was $865,000. That was over a few year period, because if you remember from the beginning, it was the photography was done over a number of years. And the majority of the cost was the photography. This cost also does not account for the PSP ground survey side of it. This is just the assessment and the imagery. We do think that the assessment costs, there's some potential for that to go down, I guess, as processes are developed and refined. And as well, the costs of the imagery, I mean, it's not all lost. It is a bit of an investment, because we do know that high resolution imagery can be used for many other purposes than just this. It seems like a lot of money, but if you think about how else we could have done this, it's actually a pretty decent cost. When I think about it in relation to the heli GPS survey, we have some pretty good stats on how much that type of information costs us. And so if you were to survey this area using heli GPS techniques, now understanding that you could only do it if it was light scattered infestation, and if it was, it would cost you approximately twice of what we paid to do this remotely. So you're looking at maybe about $1.5 million-ish dollars. That's for light infestation, and thinking about hovering over a stand of almost all dead trees. I mean, how you count them? It's easier to count the green trees, but then you still don't know how many trees are dead. So really, you cannot do this manually. So from that perspective, it was worth it. We did recognize some limitations. One is that it is only a snapshot in time. no pun intended there. And as you know, as I just showed you, the imagery isn't cheap. So it is a kind of a one-time deal. You have to be smart about where you do it. Like I said, we did this in areas where the population had kind of run its course, because you don't want to do it again next year to get an update of what happened. We also learned that the image quality has to be very high. Based on some of the quality inspection, even a little bit of smoke and haze made it a little bit more difficult. And we also learned that in this case, the image acquisition timing was important in relation to things that were causing difficulty in the classification. One was snow, the reflectance of the snow, and the other one being the deciduous species changing color. So that's the wrap up of the first project. The next project I will introduce, and I'm going to pass it over to Chris. So this time we're not using the high res aerial. We are into now Sentinel and Landsat, so free imagery. So take it away, Chris.
Yeah, the objective of this was really just to create. In the first project, we had a individual tree crown scale classification, and we were able to link those crown areas statistically to basal area mortality. Here, our objectives were much simpler. We just wanted to create a classification of is it dead or not. So a very simple yes or no classification in terms of mortality. So Mike, next slide, please. The area was 150,000 hectares, but overall we actually had stands identified through the Alberta Vegetation Inventory that we wanted classified. But because of the way satellite data is collected, we classified everything inside and outside of those stands. And again, actually, it was Castless Consulting that did this work for us. They won the competition to do this classification. So next slide, Mike. Thank you. So the data was all Sentinel-2. Sentinel, despite the fact that Sentinel-2 imagery, there's two satellites, A and B, and they have a return period of roughly 2 to 3 days at these latitudes. We had a lot of trouble getting imagery that was cloud, smoke, and haze free. So we were not able to do collect multiple dates. We were actually just lucky to get a single mosaic that was, and the dates range from 2018 all through 2019. So ideally, we would have just had a single mosaic that would have been collected in August of 2019, but we just couldn't get the imagery is just not there because of perennial cloud. And then Castless calculated a number of different vegetation indices, and again, we've seen these in previous presentation: moisture stress, NDVI, red-green index. They used tassel-capped brightness to identify areas that were not treed. And then they used, Mike, next slide, please. So here's the range of dates that we have. It was for that 3.7 million hectares were assessed. Here are the range of dates. Again, I think it's 19 separate mini mosaics were created, and each of these were analyzed separately. So next slide, Mike. Random forests. Yes, they use random forest classification, machine learning. So kind of the opposite of how they did the individual tree crown classification, which was for the ITC work, it was the unsupervised classification. Here they're using a supervised. So we were looking for is it dead or not, but the output of the random forest classification is actually, because it's it creates many classification trees, you get a probability surface. And so that was great for us. And so what we're doing now, or what we were able to do, is actually take that probability threshold or that probability surface and threshold it appropriately to kind of maximize our accuracy. And just here, one of the sort of outputs of the random forest classification is actually, it gives you the it gives you a measure of variable importance. And so for this work, the red-green ratio and, not surprisingly, the red band were probably the two most important predictor variables that went into the classification. So next slide, please, Mike. And so here's an example of, and Mike and I talked about this, we're going to try and just go back and forth between these different slides to show you what the data look like. But here is a focus, we've zoomed into a 10 meter true color sentinel image. And then the next slide, we have the probability surface. So with those oranges being high probability of red attack, and the greens and blues being less. And then, yeah, and then once we threshold that probability surface, we get our final classification. So Mike and I were debating, was our final probability 85% or 75%? I think it's 85. Castless thresholded at 85%, but we may have dialed that back. But this would be the final product, a vector polygon data set with classifying mortality or delineating mortality. So this is a very good example because there's a lot of mortality in this little slice of the landscape. But if we go to our next example, So if we go to our next example, Mike, we have much lower mountain pine beetle attack. Things start to fall apart here. First of all, our canopy height model based on LiDAR is 10 years old, 15 years old. And so there's a lot of disturbance that it becomes classified as mortality. That's not captured in the LiDAR canopy height model. We have edge effects, as you can see in the bottom left from that road. And so this is where thresholding becomes really important. Like, do you go with 0.7 or 75% or 85% so that you don't overclassify mortality on the landscape? So this is probably not a worst case scenario, but certainly like highlights some of the issues we had in lower mortality areas, and also with the vintage of our LiDAR. So next slide, please, Mike. Is this my slide?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. Right, so we are not able to separate gray attack and red attack, but correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, there wasn't a lot of gray attack in that area anyways.
Correct.
Right. And then again, and Mike's going to talk about this later, is the question of faders versus previously, these red trees are on the landscape for 2, 3, 4, 5 years before their gray attack. So how do you differentiate new faders from previous year's mortality? The other issue we had is, remember back to we weren't able to create a single date mosaic. And so we had, or Castless really had 19 individual images that they were looking at, trying to calibrate and validate the classification on, and they couldn't find red attack in all 19 of those images. So what they did was they created a model based on based on one of the images, and then applied that model to other images where they couldn't find any training data, which did affect results, but fair enough. And then we could not do volume estimates. We just didn't have the data in place to do basal area or volume estimates. So I think, next slide, Mike.
Yeah, and I'll talk a bit about the quality that we did on this. It was not quite as extensive as the previous project, but we did have some areas that this project overlapped with some higher resolution photography from about the same period of time. So we did some manual inventory of the damage, and so we had a really accurate assessment to compare to. And if we looked at all those individual cells that had mountain pine beetle in them, that we knew they did from the detailed information, this assessment missed 18% of them, which is pretty big number. We weren't too excited about that, but when we looked into a little bit more about why and what specifically was being missed, there's a little more comfort in that. So when you remember back to the cells that were being created of those 75, 85 threshold, whatever the number you might want to pick, we found that almost all the missed cells were either singles or two adjacent polygons. So we decided a greater than 3 adjacency rule was a good idea to analyze the data. And then secondly, if you looked at the actual numbers of trees that were infested within the cells, because like I mentioned, we did have the tree-based data to put it against, even though it was 18% of the area was missed, we only missed 7% of the actual infested trees. So that's not bad. That's right on target with our current heli GPS stats, or performance measures, I should say. Bottom line, we did determine that it was done as good as it can get. If we had better imagery, probably be able to do it a bit better. Obviously, the lack of training on the larger project area did also affect it. CASLIS did focus their efforts on that minimum 150 hectare area that we originally talked about. So I believe most of the training was focused in on that sort of contract deliverable area, and then those results were kind of applied to the rest of the project. And we did find that data was not quite as good. Cost-wise, the imagery, obviously free, which was one of the benefits we thought even start going down this road. But when you look at the cost, 25 cents a hectare, it's pretty much right on track with project number 1. That is if you limit it to that 150 hectare sort of model trained area. If you expand it to the larger 3.7 million hectare area, obviously your costs go way down. So you're looking at about 1 cent a hectare with that. So that's a possibility where you can possibly get to. Some of the reasons why we think that the costs are the same, even though these are some different types of projects, and you think this one would be cheaper. CASLIS did spend a lot of time on creating that mosaic, finding the imagery, and on the other hand, the previous project was, here's all this awesome 30 centimeter resolution data for you, have at it. So that was the starting point with that one. And also with this one being model training being part of it, that was a big part of it as well. So a lot of time spent on those portions of the project. On to project 3. This one is a bit of a pilot project because we have not tried it yet. But the idea for this one is to be identifying the faders. So again, back to the fade phenology slide, we're talking about the trees that are just changing color in the first year. Timing wise, we do have some plans for image acquisition. We're thinking minimum 30 centimeter resolution is, from what we've learned, is going to be required. And it's going to be in place this fall for our heli GPS surveys. So what I guess the details I have are sort of our plans. I don't have a lot to present to you on what we found, but there are a lot of things that we've stumbled across that are issues with related to this one. We want to test it in a variety of locations, so different types of infestation levels as well, likely some different types of topography, so maybe some in the foothills, some in some flat areas. And we're probably not going to do a huge area. We just want to get an idea if this is going to work before we kind of get it up into that sort of operational level. So we're somewhere maybe 25 to 50 townships. Because we're unsure if it's actually going to work, we still will having to be heli GPSing all of that area, which is the other reason for not wanting to do too much. But it'll make for a fantastic data set to assess quality, because we will have the entire area heli GPSed. Some of the issues that we've identified that are going to probably cause us problems with this project, one being a bit of a perceived bottleneck in getting quality imagery on time. And when I guess timing is of the essence in this project. As I mentioned before, we have a bit of a window that we're looking for imagery, and so if you have smoke and cloud and rain and all these types of things that we typically have some of, we might not get the imagery. And if we don't get the imagery, unfortunately, we have to have a backup plan to do the heli GPS, or else we essentially would not have a program in these areas. So there is a bit of risk to this with the acquisition of the imagery. The other issue that we're wrestling with is the georeferencing of the imagery. So ortho photos, I guess I'm not an expert on this, but it's my understanding that that is kind of the best georeferencing product you can get from the stereo imagery. But it takes time to get. And because we're talking about a 6-week window for both the image acquisition and the assessment, we can't wait around for that process. So we think, we're pretty sure that there's other methods to kind of pseudo ortho rectify them. I'm not sure what the word is, but there's to kind of georeference these photos and do some kind of rough stitching. We think that we can get it to at least 10-meter accuracy in these areas, which is fine for the level of detail we're looking for. Our accuracy threshold is 30 meters for these point level data. And then obviously timing of the image acquisition is going to impact what the trees look like. So the fading, is it going to be a good year for the fade? Are they going to really look different from the older trees? So back to this slide. I mean, timing is the key here. I mentioned we got 6 weeks. We can't necessarily start too much earlier than this window, because we want to ensure that all the trees have faded. We don't want to, because we base our budget calculations and our contracts and a lot of our things on the predictions of the numbers of trees. So if we're not getting a very good accurate estimate of those, well, not only are we going to miss them for the control program, we might find some of them, but if we do find them, they won't be budgeted for. We are going to be wrestling with the aspen changing color at this time as well, and we're really not sure if we can differentiate between these shades of fade. We think we can, but we're not really too sure. The contract that we're going to put out for the assessment, we're not going to dictate it really anything how it's to be done. I'm not really sure the best way to do it. Like Chris and some of the techno obviously might have a better idea, but we're even open to a room full of 100 trained monkeys essentially manually looking at these photos. 100% we're okay with that. If you can do it fast enough, we don't care how you do it. We know that you can do it manually. It takes about a day to do a township of high resolution imagery from our experience, so it's possible to do it if you had enough people. The quality targets that we're trying to meet, these are the heli GPS targets I've put up here for you. Whether we can meet these or not, I have no idea, but this would be the goal. 7% of the missed or the excess sites, so trees that are faders that you didn't catch, or ones that you did catch that are the wrong color. And as well, for each point sort of represents a 50-meter radius circle, and within that 50-meter radius circle, how many trees are there, how many faders are there? So and the threshold or the performance measure would depend on how many trees there actually are. So the harder it is to do, obviously, the more trees there are in there. So we've recognized that in our performance measures. The data to be used for the project, again, a little bit up in the air. We're assuming 20 to 30 centimeter resolution aerial imagery is probably what will be needed. The other usual inputs as well, we're hoping to, with the tender of the contract, to provide some samples of some stereo imagery that was taken kind of during the heli GPS window in 2020. And as well, we have the heli GPS survey data for those areas. So that would be some information that would help the contractor identify, I guess, what they're looking for. And really, how much is this going to cost? Don't know. the only reason we're trying it is based on what we know. It should be cheaper than manually doing it. So that's, if we can do it any cheaper than that at the same amount of accuracy, that would be fantastic. Anything to add on that project, Chris, before we talk about the last one?
No, I would just say the biggest thing is that the ortho rectification process takes a long time, and that's why we're the discussion around just actually skipping that and going with some loosely georeferenced stereo imagery, and which still gets us within sort of the horizontal accuracy standards that we need.
Yep. The last project I want to talk to you guys about is a proof of concept. It's just to, I guess, preface this one this isn't a GOA led project. We have a little bit of involvement just because our contact with a company called Tolo Photo from down in California. This was a number of years ago now. We were contacted by them, and they had a real keen interest in this precision accuracy detection. So when I say high resolution imagery, I'm talking like really high resolution imagery. So they're talking about 1 to 2 millimeter scale. And the idea is to see if you can identify pitch tubes from the air in the green attack stage. So in this situation, the needles are green. The mountain pine beetle had just attacked that summer, and there may be some benefits from a early detection, rapid response type program in Alberta. This is probably not up our alley anymore. We kind of have mountain pine beetle throughout our forests, and we've been 1 year behind the beetles for 20 years now, so we're okay with that. But there is some promise in this, I think, based on the little bit of work that has been done to, I think, prove that it's possible. A couple of the pieces of the puzzle is that Tolo Photo uses, I believe they build cameras, and the one camera that they propose using for this is a parallax camera, which I don't really know much about, other than the fact that my rudimentary understanding of it is that it is multi lenses. Picture like an insect eye dome of multiple lenses, and so as you're flying over a stand of trees, it's taking thousands of images at all different angles. So after you've passed over the stand, you've essentially taken thousands of images of every single tree from different angles. So the thought being that there's going to be at least one of those pictures that shows part of the bowl. And if that bowl shows some pitch tubes, there's potential to find them. So the other piece to this is the neural net machine learning part of it that does the recognition. And they tested out this part of it too with sort of, I guess, without using the parallax camera photographs. They kind of sort of modeled what it would be like. So that he used a drone with a DSLR camera at about 200 feet and chose the lens and the height to kind of approximate the signal to noise ratio of what the production camera could get. So we kind of had some images of what these bowls look like. And here's some examples of them. They did come up to Slave Lake and took some pictures. I think these might be from Slave Lake, but as well, some of the data was from down in the States. They also had people walking around in forests with cameras on big tall poles, taking pictures down at 45-degree angles of infested bowls and uninfested bowls to feed this machine learning process. And this bit of a test showed that they were able, at 1 millimeter resolution photography, they were able to pick out one infested tree in 100,000 trees greater than 50% of the time. That's not bad. And going up to the 2 millimeter resolution, they fell below that 50% probability of detecting that 1 in 100,000. So it's kind of interesting. just because this is it's sort of pushing the limits of detection. I guess it surpasses what we can even do as humans. So it's kind of interesting from that perspective, and just throwing it out there as an example of where we could be heading in the future with this type of thing. Very precision accuracy. So that wraps up the 4 projects, and I'm going to pass it back over to Chris to kind of summarize some of the lessons we've learned over the past decade working on this stuff.
Yeah, I think probably the number one thing we talk about this all the time is how important just the quality of the imagery is, and it's actually harder to get cloud-free, smoke-free, haze-free imagery than we anticipated. Even when you have the satellites between Landsat, Sentinel passing over a given area multiple times per week in combination, that's been an issue that was unexpected, and so too with our airborne imagery for the 30 centimeter stuff. Red Attack has a really strong spectral fingerprint. It's very easy to classify on the landscape if you have quality imagery, but if there's something off with your imagery, it gets much more difficult. The other thing too is, sort of as a remote sensing specialist, I thought that identifying individual tree crowns would be the bomb. Like that's exactly what you would need to characterize an infestation. But it turns out, from a strategic planning perspective, foresters manage stands, and so there was that issue taking that ITC product and then converting it into something like almost a pseudo stand, if you will, characterizing mortality in a way that a forester can use and make decisions, and can make decisions with that data set. So, and I think what we've Mike also alluded to as well, is that this can be very cost effective relative to other the image acquisition and classification can be cost effective relative to other collection methods. So
the one thing I'd like to add too is that the one thing that we've learned is that, and you mentioned it, Chris, already, is that we don't have the capacity to do all the classification ourselves. So we have had to rely on contractor resources and expertise to do this. But the thing that has been invaluable, I think, is the way that we've been tackling that. Having a guy like Chris involved in the process, having that technological side of it, as well as the side of the biological, the insect side of it, working as a team with these contractors has been essential. So things like reviewing the request for proposals, the things that the contractors or the processes that they're proposing. I mean, that's the first thing we look to Chris to say, is this even possible? Like, are they just blowing smoke or what? So it's kind of a good sounding board. And also Chris has been essential in helping us tell us what's even probably likely or not likely. So having a team set up like that has been essential for us to move forward with this type of thing. And then back to the first point too, is you don't always have to be the one collecting the imagery, because there's a lot of people out there that are doing it. So when it comes to something like looking for cumulative mortality of mountain pine beetle, and the timing of it's maybe not as essential, we're always keeping our ear to the ground to phone people, say, hey, can we borrow that for a little while? So far, so good. And Chris, you wanted to mention this too.
Oh yeah, shameless plug. In 2018, we had a conference, much like this workshop series of webinars. We had a conference or workshop in Edmonton just around remote sensing, and it was called Remote Sensing for Forest Practitioners. So there's the link to the YouTube channel down there. And so if you'd like to, the 2-day workshop covers a huge range of topics related to forestry and remote sensing. So fiber values, non-fiber values, etc. It's all there. So if you'd like to watch a few videos on your lunchtime, there's, I think, 20 or 18 videos there for you from our 2018 FGRO conference that was sponsored by FGRO.
So I think that's it for us then.